Magic the Gathering was released in 1993, and in barely more than 3 years, the Pokemon trading card game arrived and massively shook up the fledgling TCG scene. Pokemon was kid-friendly and had distinctly Japanese aesthetics, and it sold like hotcakes. Yu-Gi-Oh!, which came another 3 years later, proved that this was no fluke. Duel Masters, then, was Wizards' attempt to get in on this kid-friendly and anime-adjacent aesthetic. But since it was released nearly a decade after Magic the Gathering, it was also an opportunity to smooth over a few of the features of Magic's rules that either proved confusing or outright frustrating. Despite Duel Masters changing almost every system in the game relative to Magic, it is still very obviously a game created as an evolution of Magic the Gathering. Many of Magic's designers have been a part of Duel Masters design teams at some point, and many of Duel Masters designers started their trading card game careers playing Magic. These two games are perhaps uniquely closely related, which makes it especially worthwhile to take a deep dive to analyze what they're doing differently. Let's start with the obvious one and get it out of the way first. Magic's resource system uses specific land cards that are shuffled in as part of your main deck, while Duel Masters doesn't have any specific resource cards. Instead, players, once per turn, are able to use any card in their hand to functionally act very similarly to a land. The most common complaint of any frustrated Magic player relates to not being able to make meaningful plays due to having too many or too few lands. Duel Masters completely eliminates this risk with its resource system. Unlike a lot of the differences between these two games, where I think there are reasonable arguments for either side, Duel Masters' resource system is pretty clearly an upgrade over Magic. Some Magic designers have said in the past that the land system does act as a crucial point of randomness in the game, and that Duel Masters is just a little too consistent and it lacks drama without that random element. But I do strongly disagree with that take. There are a ton of ways to add randomness to a game, and I think that adding it into the resource system is one of the worst choices possible. Duel Masters does add some randomness back in with its life system, and I think that overall that's a much better home for it. In this way, it's able to better line up the randomness to benefit a player that is falling behind, which helps create a more distinct back and forth tempo to the gameplay, rather than just punishing players at random like in Magic's land system. I will admit that land cards are aesthetically beautiful at least, and they do help contribute to the flavor and sense of place in Magic's world building. Past that major difference, the resource systems are otherwise very similar. Resources are tapped to pay costs, and then players untap their resources at the start of each of their turns. The only other difference is a minor change in how costs are formatted. Magic spells out costs a little more specifically, while Duel Masters have only a number and color. Magics are a little bit more versatile, and Duel Masters are more streamlined and easy to understand. The life system isn't quite as dramatic as the difference between the resource systems, but it is still a pretty substantial change. Magic uses a life total, while Duel Masters uses cards as life in a shield system. This leads to a few meaningful differences. For one, Magic's life system is more granular. Creatures in Magic can deal 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6 damage, all the way up to 10 or even 20 in rare cases. Creatures in a cards as life shield system will generally deal either 1 or 2 damage, and sometimes 3 in rare cases. This allows for a greater range of damage outputs in Magic, and allows the game to include more incidental damage sources and life costs. Life gain, direct damage, and life costs are all far more limited in a shield system, but the more limited damage potential does help ensure that even low-cost creatures remain relevant into the later stages of the game in Duel Masters. Using cards as shields doesn't require any external accessories to track. To play Magic, you'll need your deck of cards, as well as either a pen and paper, a few dice, or a dedicated app. In Duel Masters, all that you need is your deck of cards. This is relatively minor, but as someone who has forgotten their dice more than once while rushing out the door, I do really appreciate the all you need is your deck ideal. Cards as Life also allows for mechanics to more easily integrate with the life system. Shield triggers in Duel Masters, life bursts in Wicross, and triggers in Vanguard all add a random catch-up mechanic into the life system. Past that, using cards as life means that those cards can be moved somewhere else after damage is dealt. Duel Masters adds them to your hand when you're damaged, Pokemon adds them to your hand when you damage the opponent, and Vanguard and Wicross use them as resources. There is just more design space in a cards as life system relative to more simple life points. One point in favor of life points, though, is that they do take up less space on the field of play. If a game already has a lot going on, a more simple life point system can cut back on a bit of the game's visual clutter. Unlike the resource system comparison, I don't think there's really a clear winner here. Both systems have good points, and depending on which direction a game's design is going, there are strong arguments for either side. There's not a ton of difference in how the two games handle their card economy. Players draw one card per turn in both. Magic has a 7-card starting hand, while Duel Masters only has 5, but this is largely balanced by the greater flexibility of each card in Duel Masters. Duel Masters does give players additional cards as their shields are destroyed, and since every card in the deck doubles as a land or spell, you aren't drawing blanks in the late game. In the late game in Magic, additional lands are often useless, which means a good third of your deck or more become blanks when you draw them at this stage in the game, which makes falling behind in card advantage even more painful. Ultimately, Magic does end up with more of a late game drop off in card economy, so I do think it was a good move for Duel Masters to give players just a little bit more options into the later stages of the game. And overall, that's the end of part 1 of this comparison. I've split this into 2 parts, partly to appease the algorithm, but also because I think discussions about this comparison are interesting enough to spread over 2 videos so people can go into a bit more depth. So, if you do have any thoughts about how these 2 games approach their resources, life system, and card economy, I would love to hear them in the comments below. Take it easy, and I'll see you in the next video.